For over 3 decades, Uganda has been under the firm grip of President Yoweri Museveni, whose rule has increasingly been characterized as authoritarian and repressive. As dissent grows, both within Uganda and among its diaspora, the stark contrast between freedom of expression abroad and repression at home has become ever more apparent, highlighting the complex political landscape of this East African nation. Ugandans living abroad, particularly those aligned with the People Power Movement and the National Unity Platform, NUP, led by Robert Kyagulanyi Ssentamu, better known as Bobi Wine, have become vocal and persistent critics of Museveni's regime. These expatriates have organized numerous demonstrations at Ugandan embassies and in major cities across the Western world, from London to Chicago, New York to Toronto. Their primary aim is to draw international attention to the ongoing human rights abuses, corruption, and political repression in their homeland, while also pressuring their host countries to reconsider their relationships with Museveni's government. Recent protests have seen passionate Ugandans brandishing placards and raising their voices against a multitude of issues plaguing their country. These include rampant corruption that siphons billions from public coffers, widespread land grabbing that displaces communities, arbitrary abductions of political opponents that instill fear in the population, suppression of free speech and assembly that stifles democratic discourse, misuse of taxpayer money that undermines development efforts, and tribal favoritism and nepotism that exacerbate social divisions. A key focus of these demonstrations has been to urge Western nations, particularly the United States, to cease their military and financial support for Museveni's government. Protesters argue that this aid effectively props up a repressive regime and undermines democratic progress in Uganda. They contend that the funds provided for development and security are often misappropriated, ending up in the pockets of regime loyalists or funding the very security apparatus used to suppress dissent. The scale of corruption in Uganda is indeed staggering. According to available statistics, the country loses approximately 10 trillion Ugandan shillings annually to corrupt practices. This figure, equivalent to roughly 2.6 billion US dollars, represents a massive drain on public resources that significantly hampers development efforts and exacerbates poverty and inequality. To put this in perspective, this amount could fund the construction of thousands of schools and hospitals, improve infrastructure across the country, or provide vital services to millions of Ugandans living in poverty. While Ugandans abroad can freely voice their discontent, the situation within Uganda is markedly different and far more perilous. The Museveni regime has consistently and brutally suppressed peaceful protests through various means. The deployment of military and police forces to violently disperse gatherings has become a common sight in Kampala and other major cities. Tear gas, rubber bullets, and sometimes live ammunition are used against unarmed protesters, resulting in injuries and, in some tragic cases, deaths. Arbitrary arrests and detentions of protesters have become routine, with many individuals swept up in mass arrests during demonstrations. These detainees often face unclear charges and are denied access to legal representation. More disturbingly, there have been increasing reports of abductions of political activists and opposition supporters. These individuals are often taken by unmarked vehicles and held in undisclosed locations, a practice that has spread fear among civil society and opposition groups. Currently, hundreds of young Ugandans languish in jail, many without formal charges or trials. Their crimes often amount to nothing more than expressing dissent against unemployment, human rights violations, misrule, or supporting opposition figures like Bobi Wine. The conditions in these detention facilities are often deplorable, with overcrowding, inadequate food and medical care, and reports of torture and mistreatment. The rise of Bobi Wine as a formidable opposition leader has led to increased targeting of his supporters. The charismatic musician-turned-politician has galvanized Uganda's youth with his vision for genuine social, economic, and political change. His message of empowerment and his critique of the entrenched political elite have resonated deeply with a generation frustrated by limited opportunities and political stagnation. However, this popularity has come at a great cost. Many of Bobi Wine's followers have faced threats, abductions, and imprisonment, His rallies and concerts have been banned or violently dispersed, and he himself has been arrested multiple times, often on spurious charges. The government's heavy-handed response to Wine's political activities has only served to heighten his profile and deepen the resolve of his supporters. Despite growing domestic and international criticism, the Museveni government has largely turned a deaf ear to calls for reform. Instead, it has doubled down on repressive tactics, further eroding democratic norms and institutions in Uganda. The judiciary's independence has been questioned, with judges perceived as favorable to the regime being appointed to key positions. The Electoral Commission's impartiality has also been called into doubt, with opposition parties alleging widespread irregularities and rigging in favor of Museveni's National Resistance Movement, NRM party. The media landscape in Uganda has also suffered under Museveni's rule. Journalists critical of the government face harassment, arrest, and sometimes violence. Several radio and television stations have been shut down for giving airtime to opposition figures. The introduction of a social media tax in 2018 was widely seen as an attempt to limit online dissent and restrict access to information. The situation in Uganda raises important questions about the role of international support in sustaining authoritarian regimes. Western nations, particularly the United States, face increasing pressure to reevaluate their relationships with Museveni's government and to consider the long-term implications of their aid and military cooperation. While Uganda has been seen as a key ally in regional stability and counterterrorism efforts, particularly in Somalia, critics argue that this strategic partnership comes at the cost of turning a blind eye to domestic repression and human rights abuses. The international community's response to the situation in Uganda has been mixed. While some countries and international organizations have issued statements of concern and called for reforms, concrete actions have been limited. Targeted sanctions against individuals involved in human rights abuses have been proposed but not widely implemented. The challenge lies in balancing strategic interests with the promotion of democracy and human rights, a dilemma that has long plagued foreign policy in relation to authoritarian regimes. As Uganda moves forward, the struggle between those demanding change and a regime determined to maintain its grip on power continues to intensify. The resilience of Ugandan activists, both at home and abroad, highlights the deep-seated desire for democratic reform and accountable governance in this East African nation. Young Ugandans, in particular, are increasingly vocal about their aspirations for a more open and prosperous society, one where opportunities are not limited by political connections or ethnic background. The path ahead for Uganda is uncertain. The Museveni regime shows no signs of voluntarily relinquishing power, and the mechanisms for a peaceful transition of power remain weak. Opposition groups, while growing in popularity, face significant obstacles in organizing and campaigning effectively. The risk of political violence, particularly around elections, remains high. Yet there are glimmers of hope. The growing diaspora movement has succeeded in bringing international attention to Uganda's political situation. Social media and digital platforms have provided new avenues for activists to organize and share information, despite government attempts to restrict online spaces. Civil society organizations, though under pressure, continue to advocate for human rights and good governance. The coming years will be crucial for Uganda's political future. As pressure mounts both domestically and internationally, the Museveni regime will face increasing challenges to its authority. The response to these challenges will determine whether Uganda can chart a course towards greater democracy and respect for human rights, or whether it will descend further into authoritarianism and repression. The resilience and determination of the Ugandan people, both at home and abroad, will undoubtedly play a pivotal role in shaping this future. Thanks for watching. If you found this video useful and informative, consider subscribing to the JB Muwang podcast for more videos like this. Kindly tell us what you think about this video. Leave your thoughts in the comment section below. Thank you.